What happened in that Senate committee room will go down in political history. Ted Cruz thought he was about to humiliate a freshman congresswoman on live television. Instead, Jasmine Crockett delivered a verbal knockout that left the Texas senator completely speechless and turned her into America's newest political superstar overnight. The moment started like any other routine hearing. Cruz, known for his sharp tongue and courtroom skills, sat confidently behind the committee desk. His signature smirk was already forming as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas approached the witness table. The 43-year-old former civil rights lawyer had been in Congress for less than 2 years, and Cruz clearly thought this would be easy prey, but what Crockett pulled out next left everyone in that room stunned. The documents in her hand weren't just prepared talking points. They were smoking gun evidence that would expose Cruz's hypocrisy in front of millions of Americans watching on C-SPAN. Before we dive into this incredible showdown that's already breaking the internet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single second of what happens next, because Jasmine Crockett is about to teach Ted Cruz a lesson he'll never forget. The tension in the room was electric. Cruz leaned forward, ready to pounce with his usual tactics of interruption and condescension. Crockett sat calmly, her hands folded, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She knew something he didn't, and in the next few moments, that something would change everything. To understand why what happened next was so devastating, you need to know exactly who these two political figures are and why this confrontation mattered so much to millions of Americans watching. Harvard law graduate, former Supreme Court clerk and a senator since At 54 years old, Cruz has built his entire political brand on being the smartest guy in the room. He's famous for his aggressive questioning style, his ability to twist words, and his talent for making opponents look foolish on camera. Cruz comes from privilege, private schools, Ivy League education, and decades of political connection. He's worth millions, lives in a River Oaks mansion in Houston, and has never hesitated to talk down to anyone he considers beneath his intellectual level. For years, he's been the Republican Party's go-to attack dog, especially when it comes to questioning Democratic witnesses in committee hearings. His track record speaks for itself. He's made seasoned politicians stumble, reduced witnesses to nervous wrecks, and created countless viral moments where he appears to dominate his opponents with superior legal training and quick thinking. Walking into this hearing, Cruz expected another easy victory against what he saw as an inexperienced freshman congresswoman. Lewis, she worked her way through college and law school without family wealth or political connections. Before entering politics, she spent years as a civil rights attorney, defending ordinary Americans against powerful institutions. At 43, Crockett represents Texas's 30th congressional district, covering parts of Dallas. She's only been in Congress since 2023, making her one of the newest members of the House. But don't let her freshman status fool you. This woman has been fighting powerful opponents her entire career, just not in the political arena. Crockett built her reputation in courtrooms across Texas, taking on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. Police brutality cases, employment discrimination, housing rights. She spent her career being the voice for people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers or political connections. Her speaking style is direct, passionate, and rooted in real-world experience rather than academic theory. What makes this confrontation so significant is the contrast it represents. Here you have the ultimate political insider, wealthy, connected, Harvard-educated, going up against someone who represents everything he typically dominates. A black woman from a working-class background who earned her position through merit rather than privilege. This wasn't just another routine committee hearing. The topic on the table was voting rights legislation, something Crockett has been passionate about since before she entered politics. As a civil rights lawyer, she's seen firsthand how voter suppression tactics affect communities across Texas. Cruz, on the other hand, has been one of the leading voices against expanding voting access, consistently arguing that such measures lead to fraud and constitutional overreach. His opposition to voting rights legislation has made him a hero to conservative voters, but a target for civil rights advocates. The broader stakes couldn't be higher. With voting rights under attack across multiple states, this hearing was being watched by activists, politicians, and ordinary citizens who care about democracy. A strong performance by Cruz could give momentum to efforts to block voting rights legislation. A stumble could shift the entire narrative. For Crockett, this was her chance to prove that the new generation of Democratic leaders could stand toe-to-toe with Republican heavyweights. For Cruz, it was supposed to be another opportunity to demonstrate his intellectual superiority and political dominance. Neither of them knew they were about to create one of the most viral political moments of the year. The hearing room fell silent as Chairman Dick Durbin called the session to order. The mahogany-paneled chamber was packed beyond capacity, with every seat filled and people standing along the wall. C-SPAN cameras positioned strategically around the room captured every angle, knowing that voting rights hearings had been generating significant viewer interest lately. The topic was the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and tensions were already running high. Civil rights activists filled one section of the gallery, while conservative legal scholars occupied another. The air practically crackled with anticipation. Everyone knew this wouldn't be just another routine hearing. Cruz sat at his position on the committee, shuffling through papers with the confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. His staff had prepared thick briefing books, and his legal team had spent hours crafting what they believed would be devastating questions designed to expose weaknesses in the Democratic position. "Crockett," Cruz began, his voice carrying that familiar tone of barely concealed arrogance. "I appreciate you taking time from your busy freshman schedule to join us today." A few Republican committee members chuckled, and Cruz's smirk widened slightly. "Now, I know you're relatively new to Congress, so let me help you understand something about constitutional law and voting procedures." He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped behind his head in a pose of casual superiority. "This legislation you're supporting today would fundamentally undermine state sovereignty and create federal overreach on a scale we haven't seen since Reconstruction." The gallery stirred slightly. This was classic Cruz. Start with a subtle insult, establish intellectual dominance, then build to a devastating legal argument that would leave his opponent scrambling. Crockett sat perfectly still, her expression unchanged. She had expected this approach. In her legal career she had faced plenty of opposing counsel who tried to intimidate her with big words and condescending attitudes. But Cruz wasn't just any lawyer, he was a politician with cameras rolling and a national audience watching. "Senator Cruz," Crockett responded, her voice steady and clear, "I appreciate your concern for my education, but I think my law degree and years of constitutional practice speak for themselves." A slight murmur rippled through the room. Most witnesses would have been flustered by Cruz's opening attack, but Crockett had pushed back immediately and firmly. Cruz's eyebrows raised slightly. This wasn't the response he was used to getting. Usually witnesses became defensive or tried to over-explain themselves when he used this tactic, but Crockett had simply stated facts and moved on. "Of course, Congresswoman," Cruz said, his tone becoming slightly sharper. "But surely you can understand my confusion when I see someone with your limited congressional experience advocating for such radical changes to our electoral system." "Limited experience?" Crockett's voice carried a hint of steel now. "Senator, I've spent the last 15 years in courtrooms defending voting rights, while you've spent that time in Senate committees, talking about them. There's a difference between academic theory and real-world practice." The temperature in the room seemed to rise a few degrees. Committee members on both sides were paying closer attention now. This wasn't going according to Cruz's usual script. Sensing that his standard approach wasn't working, Cruz shifted tactics. He reached for a thick folder of documents, his movements deliberate and theatrical. "Miss Crockett, let me share some facts with you," he said, pulling out several sheets of paper. "In your home state of Texas, we've seen significant improvements in election security and voter confidence since implementing common sense reforms. Why would you want to undermine that progress?" It was a loaded question, designed to put Crockett on the defensive about her own state's policies. Cruz was essentially asking her to argue against Texas, while representing a Texas district, a political trap that had worked countless times before, but Crockett didn't take the bait. Instead, she reached into her own folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Senator Cruz, I'm glad you mentioned Texas," she said, her voice growing stronger, "because I have some facts of my own I'd like to share." The room went quiet. Committee hearings usually followed a predictable pattern. Senators asked questions, witnesses answered defensively, senators make speeches, but Crockett wasn't playing by those rules. "Can you tell me, and the American people watching, how many cases of voter fraud were prosecuted in Texas last year?" Cruz paused. This wasn't a question he had expected, and it definitely wasn't the direction he wanted the conversation to go. "Well, Congresswoman, the exact number isn't as important as the principle of election integrity. The number is 43. Crockett interrupted smoothly. 43 cases of voter fraud in a state with over 17 million registered voters. That's less than 0.0003%. The room buzzed slightly. Crockett had just flipped the dynamic. Instead of defending herself against Cruz's attacks, she was now questioning him with specific data. Cruz's jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't used to witnesses coming prepared with their own statistics, and he definitely wasn't used to being interrupted. Ms. Crockett, while those numbers may be technically correct, they are correct, Senator. Now let me ask you another question. Crockett's voice was gaining momentum. How many eligible voters in Texas were prevented from voting due to the reforms you just praised? Cruz's eyes narrowed. He could sense where this was going, and he didn't like it. Congresswoman, I reject the premise of your question. No eligible voter has been prevented from voting in Texas. Really? Crockett's eyebrows raised slightly. Because I have documentation here showing that over 240,000 registered Texas voters were removed from rolls in the past 2 years alone. Many of them had been voting in the same district for decades. The silence in the room was deafening. Cruz had walked into this hearing expecting to grill a freshman congresswoman about voting policy. Instead, he was being presented with specific data that challenged his entire narrative. Cruz, clearly frustrated that his usual tactics weren't working, decided to get personal. Ms. Crockett, I find it interesting that someone who has been in Congress for less than 2 years thinks she knows more about constitutional law than senators who have been studying these issues for decades. It was a classic Cruz move. When the facts don't work, attack the person's qualifications. But this time, he had picked the wrong target. Crockett set down her papers and looked directly at Cruz, her expression perfectly calm but her eyes blazing with intensity. Senator Cruz, let me make something very clear, she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I don't think I know more about constitutional law than you do. I know more about the real-world impact of voter suppression than you do. The room erupted in whisper. Committee members shifted in their seats. Even the stenographer looked up from her machine. Because while you were giving speeches about election integrity from your mansion in River Oaks, I was in courtrooms defending elderly black voters who were told their registrations were invalid. While you were fundraising off fears of voter fraud, I was helping disabled Americans navigate poll taxes disguised as security measures. Cruz's face was reddening slightly. This was not going according to plan. And while you were flying to Cancun during a winter storm that killed hundreds of your constituents, Crockett continued, her voice rising with passion, I was in community centers helping people understand their voting rights. The Cancun reference hit like a thunderbolt. Cruz's 2021 vacation during Texas's deadly winter storm had been one of the most damaging episodes of his political career, and Crockett had just brought it up in front of a national audience. The room was electric now. Republicans looked uncomfortable, Democrats were leaning forward, and the gallery was completely silent, hanging on every word. Cruz's hands were visibly shaking as he reached for his water glass. His famous composure was cracking, and everyone in the room could see it. The moment that would break the internet was about to unfold. Cruz, his face now noticeably flushed, decided to go nuclear. It was a decision he would regret for months to come. Crockett, Cruz said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, I find your grandstanding absolutely ridiculous. You sit there making accusations about voter suppression while ignoring the real threats to election integrity. Your partisan rhetoric is exactly what's wrong with Congress today. He paused, clearly building to what he thought would be his knockout punch. And frankly, your emotional outbursts and victim mentality are not what the American people need from their representatives. Perhaps if you spent less time playing identity politics and more time actually learning how government works, these hearings would be more productive. He had dismissed Crockett's substantive arguments as emotional outbursts, accused her of playing identity politics, and suggested she didn't understand how government works, all while she had just systematically dismantled his position with hard data. But the biggest mistake was yet to come. Cruz's arrogance had completely taken over now, and he was about to say something that would haunt him for months. Maybe, Cruz continued, his voice dripping with condescension, you should focus on representing your district instead of trying to lecture senators who have been fighting for conservative principles since before you knew what a law book looked like. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several Democratic committee members visibly winced. Even some Republicans looked uncomfortable. Cruz had just made the fatal error of attacking not just Crockett's arguments, but her very right to be at that table. He had questioned her intelligence, her experience, and her legitimacy as a member of Congress. All while she had been systematically destroying his positions with facts and evidence. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in that room knew they had just witnessed something significant. Cruz had not just attacked Crockett's arguments, he had attacked her personally, her qualifications, and her right to be at that table. Crockett sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely lethal. "Senator Cruz," she began, each word carefully measured, "I want to thank you for that response, because you have just demonstrated, better than I ever could, exactly why we need voting rights legislation in this country." She reached into her folder and pulled out another document. "You see what you just did, dismissing my substantive arguments as emotional outbursts suggesting I don't understand government, telling me to focus on my district instead of participating in national policy. That's exactly the kind of condescension that has been used to silence voices like mine for generations." The room was completely silent now. Even the Republican committee members were paying attention. "But here's what's different today, Senator. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are the millions of Americans who sent me here." Crockett reached into her folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "Senator Cruz, since you mentioned learning how government works, let me share some information you might find educational." She held up the first document. "This is a legal brief you filed in 2018, arguing that certain voting procedures were unconstitutional federal overreach." She set it down and picked up another. "This is a legal brief you filed in 2020, arguing that the exact same procedures were essential for election integrity." Crockett's eyes widened slightly. He clearly hadn't expected her to have his own legal filings. "This is a statement you made in 2019, calling mail-in voting an invitation to fraud." She held up another paper. "And this is your campaign's application for mail-in ballots for your own staff during the 2020 election." The room erupted in whispers. Crockett was systematically exposing Cruz's hypocrisy with his own words and actions. "But my personal favorite," she continued, her voice now carrying a hint of satisfaction, "is this fundraising email your campaign sent last month, asking supporters to donate to fight voter suppression, while simultaneously opposing every piece of legislation that would actually combat voter suppression." Cruz was staring at the documents like they were radioactive. His mouth was slightly open, and for the first time in his political career, he appeared to be completely speechless. "Now, Senator," Crockett continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "since you brought up constitutional law, let me remind you of something you learned in your first-year constitutional law class at Harvard, assuming you were paying attention that day." The subtle dig sent ripples through the gallery. Several law students in attendance recognized the reference and began whispering excitedly among themselves. She pulled out a worn copy of the Constitution, not some pristine ceremonial version, but clearly a working document she had referenced countless times in court. "The 15th Amendment states that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 19th Amendment extends that protection to gender. The 24th Amendment prohibits poll taxes, something you might want to review given your support for voter ID fees." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had argued these points in federal court, not just debated them in academic setting. She looked directly at Cruz, her eyes blazing with intensity. "And the 14th Amendment, I'm sure you remember this one, guarantees equal protection under the law to all citizens. Every single piece of legislation you have opposed in the name of election integrity violates at least one of these amendments." The silence in the room was complete. Cruz, the Harvard-trained constitutional lawyer, was being lectured on constitutional law by someone he had dismissed as inexperienced just minutes earlier. Cruz, faced with his own hypocrisy laid out in black and white, completely lost his composure. You can't just," he stammered, his face now bright red, his hands shaking as he shuffled through papers, looking for anything to respond with. Crockett sat calmly, watching him fall apart, her expression never changing. "Ms. Crockett, you are twisting my positions," Cruz finally managed, his voice cracking slightly. "This is exactly the kind of gotcha politics that the American people are tired of." "Senator," Crockett replied, her voice steady as a rock, "these are your own words, your own legal filings, your own campaign materials. I'm not twisting anything, I'm just reading them." Cruz's jaw was working like he was trying to speak, but no words were coming out. The Harvard-trained debater, the man who had made a career of verbal sparring, had been reduced to complete silence by a freshman congresswoman with a stack of his own documents. The camera caught every second of it. His wide eyes, his slightly open mouth, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. It was the face of a man who had just been completely and utterly destroyed on live television. She looked directly at Cruz one more time and delivered the line that would define this moment forever. "Senator Cruz, I came here today prepared to discuss policy. You came here prepared to dismiss me. The difference between us isn't experience or education. It's that I actually care about the people I represent, and I do my homework." She stood up from the witness table, her bearing confident and strong. "I yield back my time to the chairman, and I yield the floor to Senator Cruz, if he has anything substantive to add to this discussion." The silence stretched for what felt like forever, until Chairman Durbin finally called for a recess. As the committee members filed out, Cruz remained in his seat, staring at the documents Crockett had left on the table, his own words, used against him with devastating effect. The jaw-dropping reaction that would leave millions speechless wasn't just Cruz's stunned silence. It was the complete destruction of his reputation as an unbeatable political debater, carried out methodically and brilliantly by someone he had underestimated in every possible way. The committee room erupted the moment Chairman Durbin called the recess. Committee members, staff and gallery observers were all buzzing with the electricity of what they had just witnessed. But the real explosion was just beginning, and it would happen in the digital realm. Within minutes of the hearing ending, clips of Crockett's performance were already being uploaded to Twitter, TikTok and YouTube. The moment Cruz's jaw dropped and his eyes went wide was captured in perfect high definition by C-SPAN cameras, creating what would become one of the most shared political GIFs in history. The hashtag #Crockett destroys Cruz began trending within the first hour. But it wasn't just trending, it was exploding across every social media platform simultaneously. On Twitter, the clip of Cruz stammering, you can't just," while Crockett sat calmly watching him fall apart, was retweeted over 50,000 times in the first 2 hours. The quote tweet reactions were brutal. Ted Cruz just got a lesson in constitutional law from someone he called inexperienced. The irony is delicious. 47K likes. When you try to mansplain the Constitution to a civil rights lawyer, and it backfires spectacularly. 38K likes. That face when you realize you brought talking points to a facts fight. 41K likes. The younger generation's favorite platform turned Cruz's meltdown into comedy gold. The most viral TikTok, with over 2 million views in 24 hours, was set to the sound of a record scratch followed by the Curb Your Enthusiasm theme, perfectly timed to Cruz's moment of realization that he was trapped. Another popular TikTok format showed Cruz's confident opening statement, followed by a quick cut to his stunned silence, with text overlay reading, "How it started versus how it ended." Gen Z creators were having a field day with Cruz's facial expressions, turning them into reaction memes for everything from failed homework excuses to dating app disasters. The most successful video, titled "Jasmine Crockett Ends Ted Cruz's Entire Career in 15 Minutes, gained over 800,000 views in its first day. The comments section was a mix of celebration and shock. "I've never seen Cruz speechless before, this is historic." She came with receipts, and the constitutional knowledge to back it up. Respect. Cruz thought he was getting an easy win against a freshman. Instead, he got a masterclass in preparation. CNN's headline read, "Freshman Congresswoman Leaves Ted Cruz Speechless in Voting Rights Hearing." MSNBC went with, "Constitutional Scholar Schools Constitutional Scholar." Even Fox News, usually friendly to Cruz, had to acknowledge, "Dramatic exchange in Senate hearing goes viral." The most telling coverage came from legal experts who broke down exactly what had happened. A former Supreme Court clerk explained on CNN, "What Crockett did was exceptional. She didn't just respond to Cruz's attacks. She systematically dismantled his entire argument using his own legal positions against him. It was like watching a masterclass in legal advocacy." His communications director released a statement claiming that Senator Cruz was simply giving Congresswoman Crockett the respect of engaging with her positions, and he looks forward to continuing productive dialogue on voting rights. But the statement fell flat. Conservative commentators who usually defended Cruz were notably quiet, and some were openly critical. A prominent conservative legal scholar tweeted, "When you go after someone's credentials, and they respond by demonstrating superior knowledge of your own positions, you've made a tactical error." The silence from Cruz's usual allies spoke volumes. Many Republican senators who typically rallied around colleagues under attack were conspicuously absent from social media in the hours following the hearing. Major corporations began reaching out to Crockett's office within days of the hearing. Tech companies wanted her to speak at diversity and inclusion events. Law firms invited her to headline their continuing education seminar. The American Bar Association asked her to deliver the keynote address at their annual Civil Rights Symposium. Her speaking fees skyrocketed from the typical congressional rate of $5. Event organizers specifically requested that she discuss effective advocacy techniques and standing up to institutional power. Direct references to her Cruz takedown. Netflix and HBO began preliminary discussions about documentary projects focusing on her legal career and rise to political prominence. Publishers started a bidding war for her memoir rights, with advance offers reaching 7 figures. Harvard Law School, Cruz's alma mater, invited Crockett to guest lecture on constitutional advocacy in practice. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, and Crockett's acceptance speech became another viral moment when she noted, "It's an honor to teach at an institution that clearly values learning from experience, not just reading from text." Yale, Stanford, and Columbia quickly followed with their own invitations. Legal clinics began incorporating clips from the hearing into their trial advocacy courses, using Crockett's performance as a textbook example of how to handle hostile questions. Political analysts began to recognize that this wasn't just a viral moment. It represented a significant shift in political dynamics. For years, Ted Cruz had been one of the Republican Party's most effective attack dogs, using his legal training and aggressive questioning style to make Democratic witnesses look unprepared or out of their depth. But Crockett had flipped the script entirely. She had shown that Cruz's tactics only worked against unprepared opponents, and that his reputation for intellectual superiority was largely based on picking easy targets. A veteran political reporter observed, "What Crockett did was expose the difference between academic credentials and practical expertise. Cruz has impressive degrees, but Crockett has been in the trenches fighting the actual battles that this legislation addresses." The hearing marked a turning point in how Ted Cruz was perceived by both supporters and opponents. His brand had been built on being the smartest person in the room, the guy who could out-argue anyone with superior legal knowledge and quick thinking. But the image of him sitting there, mouth agape, unable to respond to his own contradictions, shattered that carefully constructed persona. The memes weren't just funny, they were politically damaging because they made Cruz look weak and unprepared. Conservative donors began expressing private concerns about Cruz's effectiveness. One major Republican fundraiser, speaking anonymously, told reporters, "Ted's whole value proposition was that he could take on any Democrat and win the argument. If that's not true anymore, what exactly are we paying for?" The freshman Congresswoman, who had been relatively unknown outside of Texas, was suddenly being discussed as a potential future leader of the Democratic Party. The most significant indicator of her rising profile came when she was invited to appear on The Daily Show, where host Jordan Klepper played the Cruz hearing clip and asked, "How does it feel to break the internet with constitutional law?" Crockett's response was characteristically direct. "It feels like doing my job. I didn't come to Congress to go viral. I came to fight for my constituents. But if holding powerful people accountable happens to be entertaining, I'm okay with that." Beyond the immediate political implications, the Crockett-Cruz confrontation became a case study in the power of preparation and authenticity. Business schools began using the hearing as an example of effective strategy, how Crockett had anticipated Cruz's attacks and prepared specific factual responses that turned his own tactics against. Leadership consultants pointed to Crockett's performance as a masterclass in staying calm under pressure while maintaining moral authority. Her ability to remain composed while Cruz lost his cool became a textbook example of how to handle hostile questions. Perhaps most importantly, the viral moment around the hearing gave new momentum to the voting rights legislation that had been stalled in Congress. The dramatic contrast between Cruz's empty rhetoric and Crockett's fact-based arguments helped frame the debate in terms that the public could easily understand. Polls taken after the hearing showed increased support for voting rights legislation, with voters specifically citing the need for representatives who do their homework and fight for real people, rather than engaging in political theater. Crockett had been elevated to the House Judiciary Committee. Her fundraising had increased by 400%, and she was being mentioned as a potential candidate for statewide office in Texas. Cruz, meanwhile, found himself facing his first serious primary challenge in years, with opponents using clips from the hearing in their campaign ads. His approval ratings in Texas dropped to their lowest levels since the Cancun incident, and national Republican donors began looking for alternatives. But perhaps the most lasting impact was cultural. The phrase "pulling a Crockett" entered political vocabulary, meaning to methodically destroy an opponent's argument using their own words and positions against them. Law schools began teaching the hearing as an example of effective advocacy, and young lawyers started studying Crockett's technique. The story of Jasmine Crockett stunning Ted Cruz became more than just a viral political moment. It became a symbol of what happens when substance meets empty rhetoric, when preparation confronts posturing, and when authentic advocacy faces off against political theater. For millions of Americans frustrated with politicians who seem more interested in sound bites than solutions, Crockett's performance offered hope that the system could still reward competence and dedication over showmanship and privilege. And for anyone who has ever been underestimated because of their age, race, gender, or background, watching Crockett systematically dismantle one of the Senate's supposed heavyweights was deeply satisfying proof that merit still matters in America. Sometimes you just have to be prepared to demonstrate it under pressure. The political world is still reacting to this incredible confrontation, and you can bet that Jasmine Crockett's next appearance in a committee hearing will be must-see television. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the political fireworks that are sure to follow. What did you think of Crockett's performance? Do you think this will change how politicians prepare for these hearings? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed watching Ted Cruz get a lesson in constitutional law. He'll never forget. The political landscape has been forever changed by what happened in that committee room, and Jasmine Crockett has proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon in politics isn't a loud voice or famous name, it's simply being prepared, staying calm, and knowing your Ted Cruz learned that lesson the hard way, and the whole world got to watch it happen.